The rain came down in sheets, smearing the city lights into a blur of color as Detective Alan Graves drove through the winding streets. The rhythmic thud of the windshield wipers was the only sound in the car, but inside Graves' head, there was no quiet. The case files on the passenger seat sat like a silent challenge, daring him to crack them open. But he already knew what they said. It wasn't the first time he'd read them, and it wouldn't be the last. 5 deaths, 5 brutal accidents, all motorcyclists, all on the same cursed stretch of highway just outside the city limits. They'd written it off as coincidence at first, reckless bikers losing control on slick roads, poorly lit turns in the dead of night. But the rumors had started, the stories. The Ghost Rider got another one. Graves scoffed at the idea, but it didn't stop people from talking. In bars, at gas stations, on the local news, everyone had a version of the story. A man on a black motorcycle, faceless, helmetless, speeding past in the dead of night. Sometimes you'd see him in your rearview mirror. Other times, he'd pass you so fast you'd think you imagined him. Then, without fail, a crash, a death, and he'd be gone. Graves wasn't one for ghost stories. He believed in evidence, in logic, in the cold, hard facts that could be pieced together to form a solid picture. But this case was testing those beliefs. He pulled into the precinct parking lot and killed the engine. The rain softened as it hit the ground, hissing as it met the warm asphalt. Graves stared at the case files again. There was a growing stack now, each folder thicker than the last, but none of them held answers. The official reports were vague, inconclusive at best. Every victim had been a competent rider, familiar with the road. No mechanical failures, no signs of foul play. Just a dead body and a wrecked bike. But the one thing he couldn't ignore were the witnesses, the survivors, people who had seen something. Graves grabbed the files and stepped out into the rain, walking quickly toward the precinct doors. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as he stepped into the office, and the familiar smell of stale coffee greeted him. He walked past the bullpen, nodding to a few officers who were working late, before slipping into his small, cluttered office. He tossed the files onto his desk and sat down heavily in his chair. The rain continued to drum against the window, a constant reminder of the storm outside. Graves opened the top folder and flipped through the first few pages. Each name was etched into his mind now. Mark Collins, Lisa Rivera, Trent Lawson, Greg Hooper, and Anthony Ward. All dead. All victims of the Ghost Rider, if you believed the local legend. Graves didn't, but he couldn't ignore the details. Each victim had received a warning before their death, a note, an anonymous phone call, sometimes just a strange feeling that kept them awake the night before. All of them had been told to stay off the highway. None of them had listened. His phone buzzed, pulling him out of his thoughts. He glanced at the screen, an unknown number. He frowned and answered it. "Graves," he said, his voice low and rough from the long hours. For a moment there was nothing on the other end but static. Then a voice, raspy, barely above a whisper. "You can't outrun him." Graves froze. The voice was male, distorted, as if coming through a bad connection. He sat up straighter, gripping the phone tighter. "Who is this?" Graves demanded, trying to mask the chill that crept down his spine. The voice didn't respond. Instead, there was a brief crackle, followed by the unmistakable sound of a motorcycle engine revving in the distance. Then the line went dead. Graves lowered the phone slowly, his heartbeat thudding in his ears. He sat there for a long moment, staring at the black screen. The words echoed in his mind. "You can't outrun him." With a low growl of frustration, Graves dropped the phone onto his desk and leaned back in his chair. Another prank. Another nutcase who thought they could spook him with talk of ghosts and curses. But it didn't explain the motorcycle sound, so clear, so close. He shook his head and pushed the thought away. There had to be a rational explanation for all of this. Graves didn't believe in ghosts, but he did believe in fear. Someone out there wanted people afraid of the road, afraid of the ghost rider. But why? What was the point? He rubbed his hands over his face, feeling the weight of the unsolved case pressing down on him. His mind wandered back to the victims. The more he read, the more he saw a pattern. But it was elusive, always just out of reach. He needed something tangible, something solid to tie all these deaths together. The sound of footsteps outside his office made him look up. His partner, Detective Amy Reyes, stood in the doorway, a steaming cup of coffee in one hand and a folder in the other. She was younger than him by a decade, but sharp, tenacious, and had a way of digging into cases that reminded him of himself in his earlier years. "Got something for you," Reyes said, stepping inside and setting the coffee on his desk. She tapped the folder. Another witness came forward, said they saw the rider. Graves raised an eyebrow. "Another one? What's their story?" Reyes shrugged. "Same as the others. They were driving the highway last night, around midnight. They saw a black motorcycle in the rearview mirror, heard an engine, but when they pulled over to let it pass, nothing. Just gone." Graves exhaled slowly, his suspicion growing. "This is getting out of hand." Reyes nodded, her expression serious. "What do you think? Copycat? Someone trying to capitalize on the legend?" "Maybe," Graves muttered, though he wasn't convinced. He opened the folder and scanned the witness's statement, his mind already working through the possibilities. But as he read, a nagging thought began to take root. 5 dead, all warned beforehand. Now, another witness with the same story. The pieces weren't fitting together. There was something else at play here, something more than just urban legends and rumors. Graves set the file down and glanced at Reyes. "We need to hit the road, talk to these people ourselves. I want to know exactly what they saw and heard." Reyes raised an eyebrow. "You really think this ghost rider thing is more than a coincidence?" Graves hesitated for a moment, staring at the rain running down the window. "I don't believe in ghosts, but something's happening out there. I'm going to find out what it is." Reyes sighed and grabbed her coat. "Let's hope it's not our turn to meet him." As they stepped into the night, the storm still raging overhead, Graves couldn't shake the feeling that the case was about to take a darker turn. The kind of turn that would force him to confront not just the mystery on the road, but his own past and the failures that still haunted him. And somewhere in the distance, the faint roar of a motorcycle echoed through the rain-soaked city streets. The wind howled through the narrow highway, carrying the cold bite of autumn with it. Graves stood at the side of the road, staring at the faded skid marks that disappeared into the tree line. Behind him, the sound of cars speeding past on the rain-soaked asphalt barely registered. All he could focus on was the crash site, the place where Jack Steele Harlow met his fiery end almost a decade ago. Harlow's death had been a violent one, the kind that left its mark not just on the road, but on the people who lived around it. Graves had heard the stories long before he ever set foot here. Harlow had been a legend in his own right, a reckless biker with a dangerous reputation. He led a gang that terrorized the roads and anyone unlucky enough to cross their path. But it wasn't just his lifestyle that made him infamous. It was his death. The official report said he lost control of his bike, veered off the highway, and collided with a tree. His motorcycle exploded on impact, leaving nothing but charred metal and burnt rubber. They found his body barely recognizable, his helmet still fused to his skull. The investigation had ruled it an accident, but the rumors said something else entirely. Graves crouched down, running his hand over the dirt and grass where Harlow had died. The air felt heavy here, like the land itself remembered. He'd read enough about Harlow to know the kind of man he was, a violent thug feared by everyone who knew him. But there was something more to his story. The locals claimed Harlow had made a deal with the devil himself, that he was untouchable. Even death had avoided him for years, until it didn't. Graves. Rhea's voice broke the silence, and Graves stood up, turning to see her walking toward him from the patrol car, her breath visible in the chilly air. "Got something," she said, holding up a manila envelope. "Pulled some old records. Harlow's file was buried pretty deep, but there's more here than what was in the official report." Graves nodded, taking the envelope from her and opening it. Inside were photographs. Old, grainy pictures of Harlow, his gang, and their motorcycles. But what caught Graves' attention was the symbol. On Harlow's leather jacket, just below the skull patch of his gang, was an odd, unfamiliar mark. A circle with jagged edges and strange lines radiating outward. "What's that?" Reyes asked, peering over his shoulder. Graves frowned. "I've seen this before." He flipped through the other photos, stopping at one from the crash scene. It was an aerial shot of the wreckage, and there, barely visible in the burnt grass, was the same symbol, scorched into the ground. Reyes let out a low whistle. "That's unsettling." Graves stared at the image, his mind racing. This isn't a coincidence. Someone's leaving these marks at Harlow's crash site and now at the scenes of the recent deaths. Reyes glanced down the highway, where the tree line stretched into the distance, shrouded in mist. "You think it's the same person, someone connected to Harlow?" Graves didn't answer right away. His thoughts drifted back to the Ghost Rider legend, the stories about a vengeful spirit haunting the highway, seeking revenge on anyone foolish enough to challenge him. It was ridiculous, of course. Graves had seen enough of the world to know there were no ghosts, no supernatural forces at work. But this case, it felt different. It felt like something was creeping in from the shadows, something he couldn't explain. Harlow's death wasn't the end of his story, Graves muttered, almost to himself. It's just the beginning. Later that evening, Graves found himself sitting across from Carol Harlow, Jack's widow. The dim lighting of the small, run-down diner did nothing to soften the lines on her face or the bitterness in her voice. She was a woman who had seen too much, and every wrinkle seemed to carry the weight of her husband's sins. "You're wasting your time, detective," she said, her voice a dry rasp as she stirred her coffee. "Jack's been dead for 10 years. Whatever's happening on that road now ain't got nothing to do with him." Graves leaned forward, placing the photograph of the symbol on the table between them. "I think it does. This symbol was found at his crash site. I've seen it at every accident linked to the Ghost Rider." Carol's hand paused over her coffee cup, her knuckles turning white. For a brief moment, something flickered in her eyes. Fear. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by the same hardened expression she wore like armor. "Ghost Rider," she scoffed, shaking her head. "People love to make up stories. Makes it easier to explain the things they don't understand." Graves wasn't about to let her brush him off. "I think Jack was involved in something before he died. Something more than just the biker gangs and petty crime. This symbol, it's not just graffiti or gang tags. It means something." Carol's jaw tightened and she looked away, staring out the window into the rainy night. "You should let it go," she said quietly. "Some things are better left buried, Detective." Graves felt a chill crawl up his spine. "What do you know about the night he died?" Her eyes snapped back to his, hard and unflinching. "I know Jack was a bastard. I know he wasn't a good man. But whatever he did, whatever deal he made, it's his burden, not mine." "Deal?" Graves pressed. "What kind of deal?" Carol's lips trembled for a second, but she steadied herself. Jack didn't believe in much, but he believed in power. He wanted to be untouchable, to live forever on that bike of his. He made sure of it. Graves narrowed his eyes. "What are you saying?" Carol leaned forward, lowering her voice to a near whisper. "He wasn't supposed to die that night. The road took him because it had to, but it didn't take all of him." The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. Graves could feel the hairs on the back of his neck standing up. "What do you mean, all of him?" Carol's eyes were hollow as she stared at him. "He's still out there, Detective. Jack's not resting. His soul's trapped on that road, bound to it, and he'll keep riding until someone sets him free." Graves wanted to argue, to push back against the absurdity of what she was saying, but he couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't lying. The desperation in her voice, the fear she tried so hard to hide, it was real. And if there was one thing Graves had learned over the years, it was that fear could be a powerful truth-teller. "How do I stop him?" Graves asked, his voice low. Carol looked at him, her expression almost sad. "You don't." Later that night, Graves found himself back at the crash site, standing under the pale glow of the moon. The road stretched out before him, dark and silent, like a long, winding scar on the landscape. He stood there for a long time, staring at the spot where Harlow had died. His mind replayed Carol's words. Jack Harlow had made a deal, one that bound him to this place. But deals could be broken, and Graves wasn't one to give up on a case, no matter how hopeless it seemed. As the wind picked up, carrying with it the faint smell of burnt rubber, Graves heard something. Faint at first, barely a whisper. Then louder, the unmistakable roar of a motorcycle engine cutting through the night. Graves turned, his heart pounding in his chest. In the distance, he saw it, a single headlight flickering in the darkness, coming closer. He stood his ground, watching as the light drew near, his breath caught in his throat. The Ghost Rider. But just as quickly as the light appeared, it vanished, swallowed by the night. Graves stood there, motionless, his heart racing. The cold air stung his face, but it wasn't the weather that chilled him. It was the realization that Carol had been right. Jack Harlow was still riding, still seeking something, or someone, and now Graves was in his path. Sleep was a distant memory. Graves sat on the edge of his bed, his eyes bloodshot, staring at the clock ticking away the minutes to midnight. The room was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the city outside his window. But even in the silence, his mind was loud, too loud. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw it. The headlight, the roar of the engine, the darkness swallowing the road whole. It had been 3 days since the encounter at Jack Harlow's crash site. 3 days since the sound of that phantom motorcycle had followed him home, echoing in his thoughts, his dreams. Every night it was the same. A long, dark stretch of highway, the ghost rider chasing him down, the engine roaring louder and louder until he woke, drenched in cold sweat, his heart pounding out of his chest. Now the nightmares weren't staying confined to the night. Graves rubbed his hands over his face, the exhaustion clinging to him like a second skin. His body begged for rest, but his mind wouldn't allow it. He had been here before, obsessed with a case, losing sleep, pushing too hard. But this felt different. The Ghost Rider wasn't just haunting the road anymore. He was haunting Graves. The phone rang, a shrill sound cutting through the silence. Graves flinched, then reached for it with shaky hands. He didn't check the caller ID. "Graves," he muttered, his voice low and rough. For a moment, there was only static, crackling in his ear like white noise. Then the voice came, just like it had before. That same low, rasping whisper that sent chills down his spine. "Get off the road." The line went dead. Graves threw the phone onto the bed, his pulse racing. The warnings were becoming more frequent, more direct. The Ghost Rider, or whoever was behind this, was getting closer. But the question was, why? Why him? What was the connection between the deaths, the victims, and now, his involvement? He stood up, pulling on his coat and grabbing his keys. There was only one way to find out. The answers weren't here, in the safety of his apartment. They were out there, on the highway, in the darkness where the Ghost Rider hunted. And if he was going to solve this case, he had to go back. The road stretched endlessly before him, a slick ribbon of asphalt cutting through the dense woods. The rain had stopped, leaving the pavement wet and gleaming under the dim glow of his headlights. Graves drove slowly, his eyes scanning the shadows that clung to the trees on either side of the highway. Every time he passed a mile marker, his heart beat a little faster. Somewhere out here, the Ghost Rider was waiting. As he drove, his thoughts drifted back to the victims, the ones who had seen the rider just before their deaths. They had all described the same thing, the engine roaring, the headlight appearing in their mirrors, the overwhelming sense of dread as the motorcycle approached. And then, nothing. No trace, no physical evidence, just death. Graves gripped the wheel tighter, his knuckles turning white. He had chased criminals before, killers, psychopaths, but this was something else, something he couldn't explain no matter how hard he tried. The logical part of his brain told him it was a setup, a trick, some elaborate game being played by a maniac. But deep down, he knew better. The Ghost Rider wasn't human. The rain started again, light at first, then heavier, pounding against the windshield. Graves turned on the wipers, his vision blurring as the water smeared across the glass. The road ahead seemed to vanish into the storm, swallowed by the night. Then he heard it, a low rumble, barely audible over the sound of the rain. At first, Graves thought it was just the storm playing tricks on him. But then it grew louder, rising above the noise, the unmistakable sound of an engine, deep, guttural, and too close. Graves' pulse quickened as he glanced in the rearview mirror. Nothing but darkness. But the sound was there, growing louder, closing in. He pressed harder on the gas, his eyes flicking between the road ahead and the mirror. Still nothing. But the engine kept roaring, louder and louder, as if it was right behind him. A flash of light appeared in the distance, a single headlight cutting through the rain. Graves' heart leaped into his throat as the motorcycle came into view, its rider barely visible, shrouded in mist. The bike moved impossibly fast, gaining on him in seconds. Graves' instincts kicked in. He swerved to the side of the road, letting the motorcycle pass, but it didn't. Instead, it stayed behind him, matching his speed, the headlight flickering as if it were alive. "Damn it," Graves muttered, his foot pressing harder on the gas. The car lurched forward, speeding down the wet highway, but the motorcycle kept pace, always just behind, its engine snarling like a beast chasing its prey. Graves' hands shook as he gripped the steering wheel, his eyes darting to the mirror again. And then, just like that, the headlight was gone. The engine noise vanished, replaced by the pounding rain and the low hum of his car's engine. Graves let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, slowing the car down to a crawl. He scanned the road behind him, but there was nothing. No bike, no rider, just the empty highway stretching into the night. His body trembled with adrenaline as he pulled off onto the shoulder, the car idling as he tried to catch his breath. What the hell had just happened? Was it real? Or had his sleep-deprived mind finally snapped? He leaned forward, resting his forehead against the steering wheel, his thoughts racing. He couldn't keep doing this, couldn't keep chasing ghosts down the highway. There had to be an answer, something concrete, something real. But every time he got closer, the truth slipped further away, buried in darkness. Graves reached for his phone, his hand trembling. He needed to call Reyes, tell her what had happened. She'd know what to do. But as he pulled the phone from his pocket, something caught his eye. On the passenger seat, barely visible in the dim light, was a scrap of paper. Graves frowned, picking it up and unfolding it with care. The paper was old, yellowed around the edges, and the writing on it was smeared as if it had been written in the rain. "Stay off the road." Graves' breath caught in his throat as he stared at the words. He hadn't put this here. He hadn't even seen it when he got into the car. His heart raced as the engine's roar returned, this time louder, filling his head like a drumbeat. Suddenly, the darkness outside the car seemed to move, shifting in the corner of his vision. Graves looked up, his breath hitching in his chest as he saw it. The Ghost Rider. He stood on the road, a shadowy figure, his motorcycle idling beneath him. The flames from the engine cast an eerie glow, illuminating the rain as it fell. The rider's face was hidden beneath a cracked black helmet, but Graves could feel the weight of his gaze, staring straight through the glass, straight through him. The rider lifted a hand, pointing directly at Graves. The message was clear. "You're next." Graves threw the car into gear, his heart racing as he sped away, tires screeching on the slick pavement. The rain blurred his vision, the road twisting and turning as he drove faster and faster, trying to outrun the inevitable. But no matter how fast he drove, the sound of the motorcycle's engine followed him, closing in, always just behind. The night stretched on endlessly, the highway turning into a maze of shadow and light. Graves drove for what felt like hours, the Ghost Rider never far behind, always there, always watching. And as the clock struck 3 in the morning, Graves finally realized the truth. There was no escape, not for him, not for anyone. The Ghost Rider wasn't just a legend, he was death itself, riding the highway, hunting those who dared defy him. And now Alan Graves was next in line. The road stretched out ahead like an endless black ribbon, twisting into the void of the night. The moon hung low in the sky, casting a sickly pale glow over the landscape, but it was swallowed by the darkness of the trees that lined the highway. The air was heavy, damp with the lingering mist, and the cold bit at Graves' skin as he stood there, waiting. He knew this was where it would end, where it had to end. The sound of the engine had followed him, chased him through the nights, haunted his every waking hour. The Ghost Rider was never far, but tonight Graves was no longer running. Tonight he was waiting. His heart pounded in his chest, the adrenaline coursing through his veins. The darkness pressed in around him, wrapping him in silence, save for the steady hum of the wind in the trees. Every instinct screamed at him to turn back, to flee. But Graves stood his ground. This was it. This was the moment he'd been chasing, the final confrontation. He'd been drawn to this road, just like every victim before him, and he knew deep down that there was no going back. The headlights of his car dimmed behind him, a weak beacon in the shadows. He checked his watch, 2:37 a.m., right on time. The rumble started low, just a faint vibration in the distance, like a storm rolling in. Then it grew louder, closer, until it became the familiar roar of the engine. Graves' hands balled into fists at his sides. His breath was shallow, his muscles tight. The air around him seemed to thicken, charged with something unnatural, something malevolent. The Ghost Rider was coming. Graves felt it before he saw it. The cold, creeping sensation that crawled up his spine, the suffocating weight of fear pressing down on him. Then, in the distance, the headlight appeared. A single glowing eye cutting through the darkness. The motorcycle emerged from the shadows, the rider cloaked in black, his helmet gleaming under the pale moonlight. Flames licked at the wheels of the bike, a haunting orange glow against the night. The Ghost Rider didn't move like any living being. There was something otherworldly about him, a slow, deliberate movement, like a predator stalking its prey. Graves swallowed hard, his throat dry. This was it, the thing that had haunted his every step, the legend that had taken on a life of its own. He told himself again and again that it wasn't real, that it couldn't be real. But here it was, right in front of him, as real as the fear curling in his chest. The rider stopped a few yards away, his motorcycle idling, the sound of the engine filling the night. For a moment, everything was still. The wind had died, the world around them frozen in time. Graves could feel the weight of the rider's gaze on him, though he couldn't see his eyes. The helmet remained blank, black as pitch, but Graves felt the intensity of that stare. It bore into him, stripping away all his defenses, leaving him raw and vulnerable. The world narrowed to just the two of them, the detective and the ghost, standing on the edge of something neither of them could escape. Graves took a step forward, his heart hammering in his chest. His voice was low, hoarse when he spoke. "Why me?" The rider tilted his head slightly, as if considering the question. The air around them seemed to vibrate, charged with energy. And then, for the first time, the rider spoke. "You called me." The voice was like gravel, low and guttural, a sound that rumbled through the air like thunder. Graves felt the words in his bones, the coldness of them seeping into his skin. His mind raced, trying to make sense of it. He hadn't called anyone, hadn't asked for this. But then the memories came rushing back. Every night he spent on the road, chasing the legend, searching for answers. The obsession, the sleepless nights. He had been the one to stir the Ghost Rider from whatever hell he'd come from. Graves took another step closer, his pulse racing. I didn't want this. I didn't... The rider's hand lifted, silencing him. Graves froze as the rider pointed past him, toward the car, toward the road that stretched into the distance. The message was clear. There was no escape. The road called to him just as it had called to the others before him. You can't outrun fate, the rider said, his voice as cold as the grave. Graves felt the weight of those words settle in his chest. There was no pleading, no bargaining with this thing. This was a force beyond him, beyond anything he'd ever faced. It wasn't about justice or revenge anymore. This was something older, something darker. The rider wasn't just a ghost. He was the embodiment of death, stalking the highway, claiming those who dared challenge the road. Graves's body trembled, but his resolve hardened. If this was the end, he wasn't going to run. He wasn't going to be another name on the list of the dead. You don't scare me, Graves muttered, though his voice betrayed the lie. Fear coursed through him, but beneath it was something else. Defiance. He wouldn't let this thing take him, not without a fight. The rider didn't respond. He didn't need to. Instead, he revved the engine, the flames flaring brighter, casting an eerie glow over the road. The sound of the motorcycle was deafening now, filling the air, shaking the ground beneath Graves's feet. For a moment, everything slowed. Time itself seemed to stretch as the rider stared him down, the flames dancing in the darkness. Graves could feel the pull of it, the inevitability. He had been marked from the beginning. This was always going to be his fate. Then the rider surged forward. Graves' instincts kicked in, and he dived to the side, rolling across the wet pavement just as the motorcycle roared past him, flames licking at his heels. He scrambled to his feet, his breath ragged, his heart slamming against his ribs. The bike screeched to a halt a few yards away, the rider turning slowly to face him again. The engine growled. Graves reached into his coat, pulling out his gun. He knew it was useless, but it was all he had. He aimed at the rider, his hands shaking, his breath coming in short, panicked bursts. The rider revved the engine again, the flames flaring higher. And then he charged. Graves fired, the gunshots ringing out in the night, but the bullets passed through the rider as if he were made of smoke. The motorcycle closed the distance in seconds, the roar of the engine drowning out Graves' shouts. Time slowed. Graves felt the heat of the flames, felt the cold grip of fear closing around his throat. The rider was on him now, and there was nowhere to go, no escape. The road had claimed him. The motorcycle slammed into him, and Graves felt the impact like a sledgehammer, the world spinning as he was thrown to the ground. Pain exploded in his chest, his vision blurring, but he didn't cry out. He didn't move. He just lay there, the world fading to black around him. The last thing he saw was the rider, circling him like a predator, the flames flickering in the darkness. And then the light faded, swallowed by the night. Hours later, the road was silent. Graves' car still idled on the shoulder, its headlights dim, the engine ticking softly as it cooled. The rain had started again, light and steady, washing over the pavement and the trees. There was no sign of the rider, no trace of the flames, no evidence that the ghost rider had been there at all. But Graves was gone. In the distance, the faint sound of a motorcycle engine rumbled, growing louder, then fading into the night, swallowed by the endless stretch of highway, and the road remained, waiting for its next victim. Reyes stood at the crash site, staring at the empty road. The morning sun was just beginning to rise, casting long shadows over the wet asphalt. They'd found Graves' car here, but no sign of the detective himself. No body, no evidence, just a lingering silence that hung heavy in the air. She knelt down, running her fingers over the damp pavement. There, etched faintly into the asphalt, was the same symbol Graves had shown her weeks ago, the same mark from Harlow's crash, the same mark that followed the Ghost Rider. Reyes stood slowly, her heart heavy. She could feel it now, the weight of the road, the presence lurking just beyond the edge of the trees. Graves was gone, and she knew deep down that the Ghost Rider wasn't finished. The road would call again. It always did.